So how specifically do you think that this pandemic has affected politics in the United States going forward?
But what we might be seeing is more political polarization as a result of COVID. It might actually give libertarians a place where we can come in and say, why not just give freedom a try?
Being a market anarchist in 2024 is like jumping on a stock before it eventually skyrockets.
It actually is the academic consensus that Holodomor was a genocide.
I have developed something of an interest in Donald Trump with the way he's making the state reveal itself.
Trump's personality and what he says he will do makes the cathedral shake in their boots. It makes them afraid of him.
What is your stance on Netanyahu's actions?
He's basically deranged. He's basically a racial supremacist for his own people.
Hello, and welcome to Morgan Meets the Eye. My name is Evan Morgan, and I am the host of this series. My guest for today is Mentiswave, making his second appearance on this podcast. If anybody deserves to be called a libertarian of the internet age, it's him. His deep understanding of the slang, customs, and psychology behind internet culture has led him to great success on YouTube and other forms of social media. While I personally do not spend much time in the deeper parts of these spaces, Mentiswave has a clear way of breaking down the Generation Z lingo so that it's digestible, even for laymen such as myself. This is episode 21 of Morgan Meets the Eye, in which Mentiswave and I discuss the left's reliance on weak arguments, their denial of the Holodomor, and the meaning behind the internet's classic phrase, the left can't meme, among other subjects. Hello, Mentiswave. Thanks for coming on to the show. First off, where should people go if they want to see more of your content?
Oh yeah, hey, so I am Mentiswave. If people want to see my content, the fastest way to find it is just search at Mentiswave on YouTube or just search Mentiswave. It's pretty searchable name. Nobody else has this name, so if you just Google me, you're gonna find pretty much all my stuff. And thanks for having me on.
Well, welcome to the show. And for this episode, my plan was that, I thought it would be pretty productive for us to spend our time examining the political left. That is, what motivates leftist thought, how they present their arguments, and what the natural end of their reasoning is. Now, first off, one observation that I've made in regards to how you approach the left is that rather than combating the arguments that support left-wing positions with arguments that instead support a right-wing position, it appears to me that you seem to take the left-wing argument, put it under a microscope, dissect it, and essentially expose its own logical shortcomings from there. So, in other words, rather than, fighting left with right, you simply deconstruct what left actually is. So, for example, let's say that a leftist tried arguing something along the lines of, well, my lived experience as a poor black single mother, that's something that strengthens my claim that capitalism is evil. Now, there are plenty of right-wingers out there who might hear this, and they would respond to this with something along the lines of, well, my grandfather escaped poverty, he immigrated to this nation from communist China.
That doesn't work, by the way, and you shouldn't do that because you're just responding to an anecdotal evidence with more anecdotal evidence of your own. And what happens is you're just going to talk past each other. Neither one of you is going to convince the other because, of course, you both have your anecdote. And from an individual's perspective, your own anecdote is always the most valid one because you're you.
Yes, exactly. So what realistically ends up happening here is that each side just retreats into their own narrative and nothing is actually accomplished in this case. Now, where I've noticed that your videos and content seem to go, on the other hand, is that your approach seems to be taking this debate a step further and hitting it at the source by addressing why exactly arguments from lived experience aren't very persuasive and why they actually lack substance. So yes, you might make videos such as my lived experience or my surplus labor value or so on and so forth that essentially push leftists into a position where they are unable to fall back onto their familiar lines of argumentation or to just keep repeating them. So my question here is, what are the most common fallacious appeals that leftists tend to make? How should somebody who's going up against these respond to these attacks?
Ooh, the most common of all, probably the most common ones today that I see would be sort of this postmodernist idea that your truth is your truth more so based on which group you identify with, which doesn't really make any sense because that's kind of where the whole lived experience thing came in that you just went over. Lived experience is nothing more than anecdotal evidence, and of course, everyone already understands in academia that lived experience, or I should say, everybody understands in academia that just using anecdotal evidence doesn't really matter. It's not taken seriously. But suddenly, when someone says "my lived experience," then we have to take it seriously because there's this postmodernist view that if you're from some sort of underclass or what class you belong to, whether it's cultural or ethnic, or basically just a non-privileged group, then now we have to somehow pretend that lived experience is a good argument, even though it's not, even though it's exactly the same as anecdotal evidence. We're just going to suddenly pretend that a 2 is a 3 because my feelings. So, and that's kind of where we're going at that. So that's kind of one of the first bad leftist arguments is just my feelings. They will change what is true based on whether or not it will harm a specific person. And it would be nice if you could just change what is true based on whether it's harmful or makes someone feel bad. But the reality is you can't actually do that. And because you can't do that, any attempts to do so are just, you're effectively lying. And that's really a big problem with leftist thought, is that they're basically lying for the sake of feelings, and it doesn't work. The other one would just be the equity fallacy. And the equity fallacy is something it was one of my earlier videos, but it's one I talk about a lot just because of how common of a fallacy it is. It's probably the most common reasoning error today that you're going to run into with just any leftist, no matter how educated they are, whether you're talking to just a total random pleb who just watches MSNPC all day, they're going to use the equity fallacy. Or if you're talking to someone with a PhD who's a leftist, they're also going to use the equity fallacy. And that's just the general idea that any disparate outcome must be the result of discrimination. They have this knee-jerk response of where they see an outcome that is not equal between two people or two groups of people, however you want to cut it, whether it's individual or by group. They usually do it by group, but sometimes they'll do it by individual basis as well. They'll see a bad outcome that they don't like, and they will assume that it's discrimination, and that is terrible reasoning. It's really, really bad. There's tons and tons of other reasons that can cause a disparate outcome. Like, for instance, just let's say you take two groups of people and you move one and have them live by the sea and move the other and have them live up in the mountains. They're going to have different outcomes. That's not discrimination, especially let's say that those two groups of people decided to go there. They decided to live there, but you're going to have different outcomes. And over the course of many, many generations, they even might start to develop genetic differences because there's going to be different sort of genes there that are going to be more successful living in the mountains. And there's going to be different sets of genes that are going to be more successful living by the ocean or whatever. So after 1,000 years, you'll also start to see genetic differences. And that really tends to piss the left off a lot. They don't like to accept the fact that there's a small amount of biological inequality. Not very much. It's not as much as, say, the Wignots will say. Wignots will say that all differences between all groups are entirely genetic. And that's not true either. It's more like 50% genetic, 50% environmental. But there is a difference there. And that's another thing that leftists don't like to talk about because it just kind of disproves their equity fallacy.
Yes, I've noticed that those are two, fallacies that they do seem to fall on a lot. I mean, I've often heard basically when debating with leftists, a lot of the time they'll essentially throw in the towel and say, well, you don't know what it's like to be poor, so how can you possibly speak on this? But as far as other fallacies as well, amongst the leftists who are pretty prominent right now, I think of people such as ContraPoints, or I'm drawing a blank on the name.
ContraPoints is right wing. She just doesn't know it.
And the other one, I believe it's Philosophy Tube. These creators, they do openly point out that they do place great emphasis on the production quality of their videos, whether it's through lighting or through the costumes or the aesthetics. And while there's nothing wrong with that in itself, I have noticed that these people are undeniably using this own style and these aesthetics to essentially distract from the flaws in the arguments that they're making in their content.
Well,
So,
yeah, style over substance. It's when you examine it, just you take a step back and you actually examine their arguments, it does reveal itself to be meaningless. No matter how much fluff you put into an argument, no matter how much you can pump it up with as much special effects as you want and as much dress up as you want, and it doesn't actually change the validity of what you're saying.
right.
But you do have to admit that it works, and perhaps we could even learn from that. Maybe us libertarians can learn from that as well, and maybe we need to put a little bit more effort into how we're presenting ourselves.
Yes.
It's kind of silly, it's kind of stupid. However, we have to accept the fact that that is how it works. Style over substance is how the human mind thinks. We have to kind of accept human psychology, even if it's annoying, and maybe potentially beat that by having both style and substance, and then people will go, oh, hey, look at this stuff. This is not only are these guys correct, but they look awesome. Like, for instance, I noticed actually you, since the first time I recall I was, this is my second time on your little podcast here, I noticed that you've improved your look of it as well. You've improved your camera, you've got a nice little setup now, you've gotten better. You've improved your grooming too. You've done some improvements, so you get it. There's some level of style that you do want to add just for presentation. It makes people more interested in looking at what you're saying.
As far as, on this topic, I've noticed that this has become something that has been represented, on the internet, through humor. I mean, I know I'm not really somebody who would call himself a connoisseur of memes by any stretch of the imagination. But while I do, personally find them to be more of a trivial matter, I do think that this issue, of internet memes and of humor in general, does illustrate a deeper point about the nature of the leftist mentality. So, really, what I've noticed here is that, for example, if I know that you yourself have critiqued a lot of these attempts at, internet memes, for example, particularly in the case of transgender ones where they may be trying to essentially justify acts of violence through perhaps some complex, series of logic, some circular reasoning. So my question for you, Mentiswave, is what are the most common trends that you've witnessed in these leftist attempts at memes, and where specifically would you say that they go off the rails?
Well, one of them is you kind of just mentioned there. I'll kind of give the reason for it. That one where it's just a meme of the left is killing you for not agreeing with them. The root cause of that is that they are just concerned with sort of this care harm form of morality. And so in their mind, they're justified in killing someone if they make them feel bad. And that's, of course, completely insane. And that's probably why you pity them, because you might subconsciously put that together and realize that, wow, that's really sad. You're willing to murder someone just because they gave you a feels attack. And that's also one of the reasons why they have trouble memeing, because a lot of their humor isn't so much based on actual humor or ha ha ha, that's funny. A lot of their humor is just making them satisfy their feelings. And so you end up with these memes or these comics that they don't really make you laugh. They're just like, oh, look at me, I'm so pathetic. And the point of the comic is that they're pathetic. And you're just like, what? What? Okay. And you find yourself, you might even laugh at it, not because the comic itself is funny, but you laugh at it because it's just so ridiculous. You're just, what is this person even trying to say? It's not funny, other than just the fact that they drew something. They're effectively posting their L in comic form.
Yes, I've noticed another issue with the execution, let's say, in these comics and forms such as that is, for example, I mean, Shakespeare famously said that brevity is the soul of wit, and I really don't think that the left has actually taken this idea to heart, considering these extremely long, drawn-out attempts at humor. They're very long, they tend to go they don't tend to get very direct to the point. They're not very punchy, as humor is really meant to be.
That's where the commie memes kind of tend to fall into line too. When you look at the left camp meme, because they make memes that are just way, way, way too long, if you look into sort of the specific far left, the where you actually start into getting into communists and socialists who will identify as communists and socialists, people who will actually identify as even off left possibly, rather than just a left-leaning liberal who has some socialist beliefs, but when you call them out on, they'll say, "Oh no, I'm not actually a socialist," because they're either they don't really have those beliefs, or they've never really self-examined those beliefs, or they're just not aware of the logical conclusion of their own beliefs. Basically, a normie, they won't know an actual communist or socialist. What those people do is they have a tendency to make very long memes and make very long statements, kind of because to them it's a way of one-upping each other almost, showing how much they know. So they'll make a meme, say, and it's just quoting Marx and making it really long. What they're really doing is just showing, oh, look at all these leftist points I know about, and all these things I've read. And it's effectively just their ideology being copy and pasted onto a comic, and them not really understanding it, and them not really being able to reword it in a way that is concise, because in their mind, making it long almost makes it more valid, because there's this weird reasoning error that especially the more midwit types do. They have a weird reasoning error where they think that if they say more things, then they become correct. They think that if they post a mountain of just information, or if you go through some of their stuff on Reddit, because Reddit is basically a midwit hive mind, you'll see people on Reddit communism, they'll make a 10-paragraph almost essay response to just a single one-liner. And I guess they think that they win by attrition if they do that. But if you actually go through that 10-paragraph response, you realize it's completely nonsensical.
The point I'm making is that the left's inability to present their case with good humor is rooted more in the fact that these leftists aren't really trying to do that to begin with. They resort to more of a preachy moralization in this case. Their arguments are moral in nature rather than rational.
Correct. That's where the muff feelings comes in. The moralistic arguments make them feel good, as well as it lets them virtue signal their own position, which in a way, virtue signaling is just kind of a way of showing their position, showing their allegiance to the current thing, and that kind of helps them fit in with their own group of people, because a lot of leftism really is just fitting in. That's how it kind of boils down to. It's fitting in with the collective.
A lot of this seems to have eventually led to, these types of comedians nowadays, these very talentless people who really just, should not even be, successful in the first place, quite frankly. But in any case, what I'm really trying to get at here is that a lot of what the leftists present as humor is really just thinly disguised propaganda.
Are you're talking about the stand-up comedians who basically just have woke humor? Is that what you're kind of going for?
Oh, well, yes.
I'll admit I don't actually watch those guys, because I've seen pretty much just snippets of maybe 5-10 minutes of various comedians who use that kind of humor.
I envy
humor
you.
in quotations. I don't actually have a camera right now, but I'm saying humor with my hands up in quotations. It's not actually humor. What it really is prestige seeking.
Right.
A lot of the people who are specifically trying to make a career in media, whether that be video games or TV or even just stand-up comedy, a lot of them are what I like to call prestige-seeking grifters. And a prestige-seeking grifter is a person who they're trying to get in good with what the most common beliefs are and common views within what you would call the cathedral, which is really just academia plus journalism, but honestly plus media as well. And if you're relatively intelligent but not that smart, if you're somewhere between 100 and say 115 IQ or the midwit range, what you're going to be is you're going to be a person who's capable of doing well in the school. For instance, if you got 110 IQ, you're pretty good. You'll be able to get straight A's if you really put your mind to it. You might even be able to get into a prestigious university if you put your mind to it, but you'll never really be truly intelligent enough to sort of dissect what's going on a bit deeper in society. And so what a lot of them will do to sort of hide the fact that they're not actually as smart as, or not actually as capable as what they want themselves to be seen as, is they will just simply adopt the same views as what the rest of the cathedral is preaching. And so what you'll get these stand-up comedians, which we'll just use an example because that's the one you mentioned, is that these people will use their platform to essentially show that they have their allegiance. They're basically kissing the ring when they're showing that their views match what the others in journalism and others in mainstream media and other academics have. They have the correct trademark opinions trademark, and thus by showing that they have correct trademark opinions trademark, they then think that they can be sort of gain prestige within the cathedral. That's a way of them boosting their career. Whether or not they actually believe it, I'm sure they probably managed to convince themselves that what they're saying is true, and they sort of emotionally convince themselves that these are the correct beliefs to have, and maybe that's just how they believe things. Maybe they just believe that, oh, what other people say is true, that must be true, and that's just kind of what they go along with because they can't actually critique it, so they're forced to effectively accept it as true. And so then that just kind of creates the grifter problem of where the prestige seeker comes in, is that now their entire career is basically just selling out to the cathedral. Now they're effectively just a grifter. They make their money off of being the same as everybody else, and it's cringe. It's really, really cringe when you realize that that's all they're doing.
On the topic of this type of disingenuous communication, on this topic of propaganda, I do want to switch gears for a moment here, because I do know that a point of focus for you as of late has been the Holodomor, namely the modern-day denial of it, as well as Stalin's original attempts to cover it up. For context, this was a horrible man-made famine in Ukraine back in the early 1930s during the Soviet Union's first 5-year plan. Now, at the very least, 3 million Ukrainians died, and it could have very well been as many as 5 million. But like I was saying, this famine was man-made in that it was the direct result of Stalin's policies. His farm collectivization plan at the time was failing, and because of this, there was a strong Ukrainian independence movement that sought to separate from the Soviet Union. And naturally, Stalin didn't like this, so the state seized whichever little food was produced, and from there they sealed the country's borders so that no Ukrainians could escape.
Yeah, what it pretty much was on that, first off, it kind of, the most accepted number is about 3.9 million, but yeah, it's debated between 3 to 5 million, but most will say 3.9 million. I just round that to 4 million. What it's probably the best way to describe it is that it's a man-made famine or disaster that first arises from just incompetent Soviet policies due to the fact that collectivization doesn't actually work. Basically, communism doesn't work because when you try to collectivize the farms, it just destroys people's incentives, and you also run into things like the knowledge problem and as well as the central planning. It just basically doesn't work. It's a bad economic system. It doesn't actually do what they thought it would do. That was, in a way, you can kind of forgive them because back in the day they had yet to do such a massive communist experiment, and that was just the first time that it was ever done at mass scale. Nowadays we can look back on it and see, okay, yeah, this system fails because what people actually do is they go against the collective because people are individuals. Collectives don't actually exist. It's just a nonsensical system. It doesn't actually work because people don't have just magic collective knowledge. People are individuals. Humans are 90 to 110 IQ monkeys. We are not 300 IQ omnibenevolent angels, omniscient people who just know everything and understand the subjective needs of every member in our community. We don't have that kind of psychic mind reading powers to know that. We need to actually use prices to be able to calculate the value of what these foods of grain are. So that's the first problem, is that communism just doesn't work. And so, of course, there was a famine as a result of their bad policies. And from that, of course, now you have a famine going on. Then Stalin just kind of blamed Ukraine to some degree. And so that's where the genocide comes in, is that you could almost call the thing that was done against Ukraine as a opportunistic genocide, where, okay, this isn't going very well, but hey, Ukrainian nationalism, so let's use this as an opportunity to screw Ukraine over. And so there's a few things that he passed that were specifically targeted to screw Ukraine over, mainly just more aggressive blacklisting and locking their borders down. So now if they're starving to death, they can't flee. And that's kind of the smoking gun, I would say, is the fact that the borders in Ukraine were locked down where other ethnicities, because there was famine all across the Soviet Union, because again, communism doesn't work. So there were other countries where that also had a lot of deaths going on as a result of the famine and starvation and whatnot, which was also horrible. But where the smoking gun comes in, that it was Ukraine, is why did they specifically lock Ukrainian borders down? Why did they actually blacklist, I believe it was around 37 to 39 districts in Ukraine, to the point where they just weren't allowed to trade food at all? And they specifically did that, targeting Ukrainians. And Holodomor deniers, they don't really have a good answer for that, or what they'll do instead. For instance, one of my responses to my Holodomor video came from Bad Panda, also known as Bad Empanada, but Bad Panda is more fun to say, so I say Bad Panda. Is he just kind of brought out the Mark Tauger defense, and Mark Tauger is a scholar, and he's the one that you're going to see cited the most among tanky groups. If you search for things like, if you go to, say, Reddit, because commies love to be on Reddit, and you search for Red Famine and say r/communism, what you're going to immediately run into is this little review of Red Famine by Mark Tauger, where he allegedly debunks Red Famine. He doesn't. He completely fails to debunk it, and his reasoning is terrible. That's actually what's going to be my next major rant. Is I'm going to be kind of going into that review and explaining why Mark Tauger is pretty much a stereotypical pedant. He just nitpicks at things. He doesn't actually ever refute the central point. And Mark Tauger, what he will kind of do is he'll just point out to random inconsistencies that don't really matter. He doesn't actually refute anything that people are saying about the Holodomor. Like, for instance, when confronted with Ukrainian borders being shut down, Mark Tauger would be like, oh, well, only about 200,000 people were actually caught at the border, and that doesn't match up with the 4 million figure, so therefore it doesn't actually matter. And that's, of course, brain rot reasoning. That's completely brain rot reasoning, because that's not counting the number of people who would try to flee if the border wasn't there. Just because 200,000 or so were actually caught, that doesn't actually tell you who just simply stayed in their village and didn't even attempt to cross the border because they didn't even want to risk it for the biscuit. And Tauger just kind of completely ignores that kind of qualitative analysis, because you can't actually measure empirically how many people would want to flee if they could flee. And so what a lot of kind of the people like Tauger do, I would call them strict empiricists, people who only rely on empirical data and just don't rely on rationality at all. They just don't use logic, period. They just don't even think about things using reason. They just like, oh, I can't quantitatively measure this, therefore it doesn't exist. Brain rot, absolute brain rot. It's a cancer on academics that some people think like this, and Tauger is a perfect example of this kind of midwittery.
As far as these sources go, I can't believe I'm really about to say this, but there's a whole load of more where that came from. And
yeah, on sources, the funny thing is, I mean, it actually is the academic consensus that Holodomor was a genocide. And so another thing that tankies will lie about is they'll try to say that, oh, Mark Tauger is the centermost, most prestigious authority on Soviet history and the famine, and so you should only listen to him when it comes to the Holodomor, and you should ignore all these other academics who say that actually was a genocide. In reality, he's a joke. Tauger's a joke.
yes.
I'm going to be basically, I have already done pretty much half of my Holodomor video follow-up. It's going to be a long one, and I've already finished the point where I'm basically just ripping Tauger apart. His work is terrible. I'm sorry, Tauger, if you're listening to this, but your life's work is trash.
As far as, these Holodomor deniers, a lot of them do tend to argue that it wasn't a genocide because Stalin didn't set out to do what he did on purpose. And there are some who deny that Stalin was the cause of the famine altogether. So basically, what I'm kind of curious about here then is, how do Holodomor deniers defend their case? And how do you in turn counter a lot of these arguments?
I mean, you want me to just put it to you simple?
Sure.
They lie. That's pretty much where it goes. What they'll do is they'll just take some kind of data out of context, or they'll do what Tauger does and nitpick at something while just completely ignoring the overall context and overall all the data and what it actually means, and they'll just lie. Or a really common one that they'll do is they'll demand that you provide them with a primary source when you're quoting a historian that says that the Holodomor is a genocide, and they'll demand the primary source behind what that historian is saying. And of course, what they're really doing when they say that, when they say source on that, is they're actually making a form of Gish Gallop. Because historians, what they do is they compile data from the hundreds of thousands of archives, and they put it into just one sort of concise narrative of what it means. Because when history, the annoying thing about history is it's not really an exact science. It's all just kind of based on hard evidence, and what actually being an academic historian and going through things involves going through dozens and dozens and dozens of paperwork from a long time ago, and most of it is going to be effectively really, really boring. I guess that's a way to put it. You're going to be going through papers that most of them don't really say much. They're various archives of, say, what this person did on July 5th, 1951. And it's just going to be this person did their duties for the day, and that was it. And there'll be some various clerical things that they did, and that's all. And you have hundreds of thousands of papers that say things like that basically don't really tell you anything. And historians, what they'll do is they'll just try to find the ones that actually they'll piece together many primary sources to actually get a picture of what happened. And so when a tankie asks you to give them only primary sources, what they're really doing is they're saying that you need to now do the same work that a historian did, which can take months and months of your time to actually do. And they know that you can't actually do that. They know that that's an unrealistic thing to ask for, but they ask for it anyway because to a casual onlooker in the context of a debate, they're just going to assume that because you don't have an immediate answer for them on that, and that makes you wrong. But of course, in the context of, say, a live debate on the Holodomor, you've only got maybe, in live debates, you got maybe 30 seconds to a minute to answer. So of course you're not going to be able to do something that requires months upon months of work to do and give the tankie what they're asking. And they know that, and that's a form of them lying, because what they're actually doing, of course, is that they're taking their sources out of context. And they're just lying.
It's very disingenuous. And to begin with, I do find the counter-argument that Stalin was simply unaware, that his actions were killing people to be weak, even if it was true, which, as the hard documentation does prove, it is not true.
Yeah, there were letters with Stalin that were revealed in the archives. Stalin knew it was going on. We know that Stalin knew it was going on. That's another actual dishonest argument that tankies will do, is that this is something that Bad Panda actually made, is the little argument that, oh, well, when the Soviet archives were open in 1990, then this was all debunked. It was all debunked, and the reason that we still accept that the Holodomor was a genocide is because of the evil capitalist regime of the evil West and whatnot. But no, the truth is that the Soviet archives actually confirmed that it was a genocide. What the Soviet archives opening up actually did is all it proved was that the famine from the get-go, when it was initially being planned, was not actually planned from original to be a genocide against their own people. They did sincerely believe at first, when they were actually drawing up their farm collectivization scheme, they did believe at first that it was actually going to work. And the funny thing is, that's, if anything, even worse for them, because it shows that the communists not only did a genocide, but they also don't know what they're doing, and their system doesn't work. So it's not actually the W that they think it is. It's actually a massive L. And so, of course, people who say that it's a genocide now are more talking about that it was an opportunistic genocide, that it was intentionally used as a weapon against Ukraine to crush Ukrainian nationalism. But nobody actually thinks that the original plan of collectivization, as it was drawn up before things even got started, was going to be a genocide. It was just that, oh, well, this is going on, so let's lock Ukrainians down and blame them and blame the gulags. And another thing on the Soviet archives is, of course, that the letters from Stalin revealed that he did know what was going on. So again, that's kind of where the sort of tanky argument that I made fun of them is that they inevitably at some point will say something that logically requires them to say the same thing as, well, you can't prove that Stalin knew that locking down and stealing food from starving people would kill them, therefore it wasn't a genocide. Because that's of course ridiculous, but that's effectively what they're saying when they deny the Holodomor, because we have evidence that Stalin did know those things, and yet he did that to Ukrainians anyway. So did you just not know that locking someone in a box and refusing to give them food would kill them? That's pretty much it. It's an insane argument to even make. It's crazy denial. In some ways, it's even dumber than Holocaust denial, because Holocaust denial is very wrong. It's very incorrect. The Holocaust definitely happened as well, but at least with them, some of their arguments might seem correct at first. Like, oh, wooden doors on gas chambers. That doesn't make sense. Of course, they're lying, but at least it's an argument that might logically make sense until you realize that the Nutsi is lying to you. But with Holodomor denial, it's just wrong on a rational level. It just doesn't even make sense.
I'm glad you pointed out as well the absurd hair splitting behind the argument that starvation cannot count as genocide because it's some kind of natural process. It's not directly, put on somebody by somebody else. I think it's a completely pointless distinction to try making, and I think it's a bit insulting to the Ukrainians as well. I mean, because after all, the implicit argument that's being made here is that the Ukrainians are responsible for their own death in that case, since it's supposedly it's not the state, directly engineering the situation. It's not the state's fault. I mean,
Except for the 1,100 brigaders that
yeah,
Stalin hired to steal food from Ukrainians.
exactly. Yes. Yes. I mean, the truth of the matter is the Holodomor was not the Ukrainians going on a hunger strike. I mean, this was a situation that they were, thrust into involuntarily, and another party, in this case, Stalin's government, voluntarily thrust them into that situation. And there is also the theory surrounding, the kulaks, for example, as being the people, driving this particular famine. And I'm curious what type of rebuttal you offer to this particular theory.
I mean, the fact is there's just no real good evidence for it. It's effectively a weird, tanky conspiracy based on old Soviet propaganda. A lot of Soviet propaganda was based on class war, similarly to how far-left socialist thinkers today use a racial and cultural divide. Back in those days, it was more of a class divide, and kulaks were really just a class of peasants who were rich enough to have their own land and hire help. And what they would do is that they would just basically blame all problems on the successful people. Kulaks were really just successful peasants, and so they were thus the scapegoat for all problems, and they would just find reasons to blame them for all problems. So when tankies use that argument, all they're really doing is repeating Soviet propaganda that you should blame everything on the successful people. And in a way, it was actually an early version of the equity fallacy. It's seeing that, oh, these people have a better outcome, therefore they must be doing something wrong or doing something evil. They must be stealing from his fellow man in order to be more successful. It couldn't possibly be that they're just more competent farmers. That couldn't be it. They can't just be more competent. They must be winning because they're cheating, because everyone's equal, therefore everyone should have equal outcomes, and anybody who doesn't have an equal outcome is either being discriminated against because they are less successful, or they must be cheating because they're more successful. It, at its core, is just bad reasoning. That's all it really is. And when you see communists repeat that, they're just going by Soviet propaganda, which is based on essentially the equity fallacy.
The kulaks being behind this event is an especially, particularly disingenuous form of Marxist propaganda. However, the counter-argument that I'm particularly confused by is the claim that the Holodomor didn't happen to begin with. This is perhaps not as prevalent as other forms of Holodomor denial, but it's still one that's pushed by certain fringe groups. So how do you push back against claims that the Holodomor didn't happen altogether? That it's a myth, which is pushed by a lot of Ukrainian nationalist groups, such as Azov.
Oh, I mean, the ones that say that it's a myth outright to the point where especially if they try to deny that the famine even happened, I mean, at that point, you're effectively getting into flat earthism. where they're just denying evidence outright. Even historians who don't believe it was a genocide, because Mark Tauger, regardless of his bad reasoning for it, he is an actual respected historian. He's pretty much the only one that takes the tanky position on it, but he is an actual respected historian. But even he will admit that the famine happened, and even he will admit that at least part of it was due to Stalin's bad policies. He just tries to say that it's primarily caused by natural causes, such as bad weather or droughts and whatnot. He'll say that that was the primary reason for the famine. But no historian at all, period, denies that the famine itself actually happened. I mean, even the Russian Soviets at the time eventually admitted it. And of course, the Russian government today admits at the very least that there was a famine. So anyone who tries to even deny outright that it happened at all, they're effectively, you can just pretty much dismiss them in the same way you dismiss someone who claims that they were kidnapped by aliens in a UFO and had a probe shoved up their butt. It's kind of that level of psychosis you're dealing with. Nobody actually believes that. The evidence is overwhelmingly against them. You almost don't even have to be confused by their argument, because they're just denying reality at that point.
On this whole topic of the Holodomor, this is something where it really does stand to show the stark failure of, the whole social communist process, really. This is not really the only attempt at this type of process. We've seen this, in subsequent attempts across the world. For example, one leader who I think does not catch nearly enough criticism for his socialist policies would be Salvador Allende, for example. Pinochet, he is somebody who certainly deserves to be criticized, but I do think we should also keep in mind the way that Allende's policies had also laid the groundwork for Pinochet's subsequent dictatorship. Now, particularly, the reason I'm bringing up Pinochet, though, is because I've been seeing a comparison that I just think is so outrageously false, where they'll be saying that, how can, libertarians defend leaders such as Pinochet and Javier Milei? And I find that kind of silly, considering I don't think that, Augusto Pinochet and Javier Milei are really anything alike as far as leaders.
Pinochet was more like an alt-right guy who had some free market policies, but overall was still just a dictator. Now, a lot of times, in a way, we kind of create this problem as well, because we use helicopter memes as sort of a joke, and leftists will take that at face value and not realize what it actually means.
They take it seriously.
Like, I do that as well, and of course, it's just a joke to annoy them, and we know that that's not actually what physical removal really means. And of course, Javier Milei, no, Javier Milei is more like just your standard gradualist libertarian. He wants to effectively dissect the state and lead to a more free society.
And it is also worth noting as well that Pinochet is somebody who was driven by more of the Chicago School of Economics as well. There was the Chicago boys at that time who were themselves trained by Milton Friedman, and Milei is very outright, a follower of Austrian economics.
Correct. One thing I like to point out is that the Chicago School of Economics is really just, their only main flaw is that they try to use empirical data to figure out what the Austrian school figured out 50 years ago. Right. That's pretty much the Chicago School of Economics, is trying to use just hard, just data-based evidence of discovering what you could have figured out using reason a long time ago.
But while we are speaking about Javier Milei, I am kind of curious what your take is on him, and what his election really portends for the libertarian movement, for example. Prior to his election, quite frankly, our ideology was seen as almost something of a novelty. People didn't see it as something that was really viable. They thought it had no real, practical application. But at this point, we can now officially point at somebody and say that, a president of an actual nation who outright calls himself an anarcho-capitalist is in power. And I personally think that this bodes well for the libertarian community going forward. And basically, to kind of give a sort of metaphor for this, I would compare it almost to the stock market, because I would say that, for example, to stand up for, let's say, Black Americans or women or the LGBT, to kind of, call out for them in terms of identity politics in 2024 is something like jumping on a stock after it's already skyrocketed. I mean, it's nowhere near as bold or commendable of a statement as it would have been back in the 50s or 60s, for example. But on the flip side, being a Rothbardian or a Hoppian, uh, being a market anarchist in 2024 is like jumping on a stock before it eventually skyrockets.
Right. If Javier Milei is actually successful and does things right as he says he will do, then Argentina is going to be quite successful in about a couple years or so. And that does actually bode very well for sort of snack tube as a whole and libertarianism as a whole. So it's a nice little white pill. The only black pill in Javier Milei is that how bad it had to get before Milei was even elected. A lot of people don't, especially normies who weren't really paying attention to his election at first, they don't realize just how corrupt and of a failure the administration that came before Milei was. The government had in the Argentinian state effectively was kleptocratic. They were effectively just stealing from their own citizens, and things were getting really bad. And inflation wasn't really so bad as Zimbabwe tier. It wasn't to the point where they were printing out $100 trillion notes, but inflation was getting bad to the point where their currency would be worth half as much in the same year. And that's, of course, insane level inflation. It's around 100%, even higher than that. And because the government was failing, the Argentinian people, the reason they elected Milei is because, like, well, things are going so poorly, let's just put our faith in this system that we haven't even tried before, because it can't really get much worse than these guys. And so that's just kind of an unfortunate. There's a white pill in there and a black pill in there. The black pill is that in order for people to finally give those of the Austrian School of Economics a chance, the government has to royally screw up everything. And of course, right now, because the cathedral is more or less liberal left leaning, we're also seeing a problem where they just kind of effectively lie about how Milei is doing, and they're blaming him for the problems caused by his previous administration. For instance, they'll cite those high inflation numbers and kind of leave out the fact that that's what the inflation was before Milei even took office. And they'll say, "Oh, look how high the inflation is in Argentina," before his policies have even had a chance to even get into anything. And of course, they're only talking about the inflation of Argentinian money. They're only talking about inflation of pesos and whatnot. And of course, Milei, one of his policies is that he wants to allow some competition within the market in terms of currency being used. And he wants people to be allowed to use dollars, or businesses to pay people in dollars. So, of course, you might actually see the valuation of the Argentinian central bank going down, because he effectively wants to get rid of them anyway. That's going to happen at first. You're going to see some disastrous price changes at first while he's getting rid of them because of how corrupt they are. But of course, later on down the line, things will be better overall because they were corrupt and not actually helping the Argentinian people. And so what a lot of the left liberal cathedralite academics or journalists are going to do is they're going to report on that and pretend like it's Milei's fault and pretend like it's something that we didn't expect was going to happen anyways.
The Argentine peso was really just on the verge of absolute collapse at the time that Milei came into power. The ideal scenario would be for Argentina to choose Milei because they actually want to, because they really want, they've decided on their own accord that that's who they would simply prefer to be in power, rather than being.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it'd be nice if the
yeah,
Argentinian people selected them because they all just kind of magically became natural law theorists.
yes,
But that's kind of where I was going with the black pill. That's not actually what
right,
happened.
right,
They were just kind of going it as a hurrah.
right.
We have,
Their
we'll do
back
it
was
because we
against the
got nothing
wall.
else to do. Yeah.
It was almost as though they didn't want Milei so much as they needed him in that context. And one thing I'm noticing, to kind of draw this comparison closer to home here in the US, a lot of people are drawing parallels between Milei and Donald Trump, for example. Now, I personally think that this, comparison is faulty in several ways. I don't think that Trump is, the American equivalent of Milei by any
No,
stretch of the
not at all.
imagination.
Milei is. I mean, there's some aspects of Milei in that he has an aggressive and combative personality, similar to Donald Trump, but they're really not the same at all in terms of policy and what they believe. The first problem is that Milei is, again, more of an Austrian economics libertarian, whereas Donald Trump is a standard Republican that, or really as I like to call a boomer conservative, that people wish was more libertarian than he actually is.
I will.
Donald Trump, he has issues. I'll just put it that way. I mean, we could poop on Trump, but I'm probably one of the few people who's relatively neutral to Donald Trump. But the problem with him is that he just kind of doesn't do what's needed to be done. Trump will say that we need to say drain the swamp, and then when he actually gets in power, he abolishes exactly 0 corrupt agencies, and instead just puts some other random person in power while he's in charge. And then of course they backstab him, and we're not any better off for it. And nothing's really changed in his 4 years that we actually had to gain for Donald Trump. So it's just like, eh.
I see Donald Trump less as a literal figure who's capable of doing good for society, and more so as just a symbol to the people. And I will say, in light of him being a symbol, I have developed something of an interest in Donald Trump that I didn't have previously. And to be clear, this has nothing to do with the man himself or any of his particular policies, but rather with the way he's making the state reveal itself. Because, for example, I'm under the impression that he's not going to be allowed to retake his office under any circumstances. But I'm curious to see how brazenly tyrannical he's going to make the government look in preventing him from doing that.
Oh yeah, Trump is definitely useful. Trump is great in many ways. Just not he's not great in the sort of, oh, Trump is a 10-dimensional chess master, like a lot of the MAGA-pedes will say that he is. But Trump definitely has his uses, and one of those uses is that Trump's personality and what he says he will do makes the cathedral shake in their boots. It makes them afraid of him, and that makes them do stupid things that reveal themselves to the normies. And so to that degree, Donald Trump is actually great, not so much because of who he is and not so much because of his policies. They're really very standard Republican policies. There's actually not very much amazing about him that really stands out. But because the establishment hates Donald Trump so much, they will do stupid things that make it obvious even to some of the most diehard NPCs who, again, just legitimately sit on their butts watching MSNBC all day. And even then, they some of them will start to question the narrative about what's actually going on and just how corrupt the state is. And Trump doesn't even really have to have that as his goal. I don't even think Trump is trying to reveal how corrupt the establishment is. Trump is just himself, and the way he does things causes them to accidentally slip off the mask.
We already had a taste of this back when Colorado, for example, tried to remove him from its ballot. In the name of democracy, of course. And look,
save democracy by not allowing people to vote.
I'm somebody who's obviously, opposed to democracy, but I would say that attempting to strengthen it by censoring the candidates and limiting the potential options for the voters to choose from is completely backwards. I have something of a theory that actually a lot of the criticism towards Donald Trump is from people who are simply just angry at him for winning back in 2016, for example. I think a lot of it is just kind of frustration that he had simply proven them wrong after saying he wouldn't win. People don't really want to own up to the fact that they were essentially wrong about him. However, this actually kind of leads me to my next point, and this is something I really wanted to speak about. I believe that this same principle applies, tenfold really to the COVID hysteria, for example. And a lot of people don't want to admit that they were simply wrong on this issue. A lot of people don't want to admit that, in their cowardice, really, in their putting of pure consequentialism over any type of values, they had ended up calling for very bad, stances. This is why we're seeing, calls for pandemic amnesty, for example. We're seeing people who are realizing now that they're on the losing side of this argument here. And they want to save face, essentially, so they don't have to change their minds and essentially admit that, they had resorted to mass tyranny here. They had resorted to authoritarianism.
Right. People gave into the state and saying that, we need the state to shut everything out. We need to give all this power to the state. And we need to be okay with the government printing trillions upon trillions of dollars in relief, which of course mostly just went to their corporate benefactors and those who are in the, what I like to call private and name only corporations like BlackRock, who are private, but not really. And of course, we see that, and we see that it didn't actually help, and we could have just basically done nothing and probably been exactly the same, and just letting people decide for themselves what to do, and we probably would have been exactly the same. Mainly because now what we know now about COVID and how it spreads is that most of the measures we took made little to no difference. And I mean, masking might help a little bit, but it's better to just let people choose for themselves on whether or not to mask. Having a mandate didn't really help anything. And what we see now in COVID is really just people realizing that they almost cucked to the state entirely. People realizing that, oh, hey, wait a minute, this didn't actually make sense, and we just wasted a whole bunch of money, and now we have Joe Biden in charge. Because a funny thing that happened with COVID is that a lot of people who were in power at the time, at the head of state, lost their reelection. It wasn't just Donald Trump. Pretty much everybody got blamed. Everybody in government, they just blamed the highest office, and a lot of them didn't get reelected. Trump probably would have won re-election if it wasn't for COVID. Not even getting into the whole election rude conspiracies that effectively just get you banned from YouTube anyway. But regardless of whether or not any of those are true, I think the main reason, in fact, a lot of analysis agree with me on this, is that Trump was actually on track to win re-election if not for COVID, and people just blaming everything on him.
So, how specifically do you think that this pandemic has affected politics in the United States going forward? What is your forecast, really?
That's a really hard call because I think some people have learned their lesson and some people have not. I think a lot of people, they've now been just kind of psychologically conditioned to accept whatever they're told. While on the opposite end of the spectrum, people have been psychologically conditioned to not accept what they're told and just assume that anything authority says is wrong. So what we might be seeing is more political polarization as a result of COVID, which is something that has already been kind of happening over the last 20 years anyway.
Right.
Is that the left and the right overall have been just sort of moving further away from each other. And while us libertarians are just like, interesting. And perhaps one white pill out of this is that the polarization might actually give us room to grow. It might actually give us libertarians a place where we can come in and say, hey, why not just give freedom a try? Why not give people choosing for themselves what they want in the market a try? Why maybe we just don't need a nanny state at all, period. And maybe that might actually give us some leeway to come in between the polarization. Not as a centrist party, because we're not. We're definitely not centrist. Most people would consider us far right, just a different kind of far right.
The thing I've noticed is that at least, the libertarian movement has stayed constant. Whereas, 20 years ago, for example, it was the Republicans who were, who tend to be seen as the more hawkish party. Whereas nowadays, it almost seems as though it's the Democrats who are pushing for more hawkish measures.
Well, that's because hawkism and being a war hawk is really just based on who's in charge.
Right.
Back then, it was still sort of Republicans who almost completely dominated the military. But a lot of Democrats, specifically DNC, they've been kind of working against that because they knew that that was a weakness in their party. And so they've been kind of making measures to sort of wokeify the military and thus gain some kind of power over it and make it so that the military is more in line with their sort of weird quasi neoliberal socialism mixed agenda. And so now the left is more, suddenly leftists are more supportive of interventionism and whatnot, and giving billions of dollars to NATO and donating billions of dollars to Ukraine, and of course donating billions to Israel and whatnot, or at least the neoliberal types. The far left supports Palestine, but that's a whole other thing we can get into.
In fact, I think this would actually be a great time to get into that, to the whole Israel and Palestine conflict that's going on currently. This has been something of a polarizing issue, and it's something that I've noticed that a lot of people, on the left and right, almost aren't sure, which side to choose in this case, which side they're supposed to go with.
Pick a sideism and its consequences, because they're both wrong. That's what's confusing people. Both Palestine and Israel in this conflict have issues where they're in the wrong. The issue that people aren't really looking at is that there is a very big human psychology element in Israel versus Palestine. A big problem with them, and a reason why the only really valid solution to this conflict is unfortunately that one of them just kind of has to leave. One of them has to just give up in this conflict and leave and go elsewhere, is that Palestinians and Israelites effectively hate each other. They've been effectively raised to hate each other. And it's very, very hard for people to break out of that kind of cultish brainwashing. It's almost impossible for, I'd say, most people. Very few people have the humility to look at, say, the religion they were raised in and accept the fact, oh, wait, this thing that I've been told is true and believed is true all my life isn't actually true. Very few people actually have the guts to go through what they've been taught and criticize it honestly to see if it really is true. Very few people will do that. And so when you have two groups of people with very different cultures and very different religious beliefs being raised to from basically the cradle to the grave, being told and reinforced every single day that other team bad, other team at fault for all your problems, other team evil, they worship a wrong version of the religion and whatnot. We are the ones who hold the rightful divine rule and the rightful divine God-given right to this land, and they are the evil demonic beings who have taken this land from us. Very, very few people actually have the ability to break out of that and realize that it's nonsensical. Very few people can do that. And because of that, you see a lot. You see Israel, first off, abusing what they've been given, because Israel does have more power in, I'd say, the hierarchy. And that's where the leftists come in, because leftists effectively only support Palestine because Palestine, they're the ones who are at the bottom of the hierarchy. Leftists are kind of viewing this from a person at top of hierarchy, bad person at bottom of hierarchy, the oppressed minority. That's how they see it. And that analysis is wrong. Not so much because Palestine is in the right or Israel is in the wrong, but it's just a silly way of looking at it. But that effectively is why they support Palestine, because they just blame Israel for that. But in some ways, there's some truth to that, because Israel actually does abuse the funds that they're given, which is why we shouldn't be sending any aid to Israel. Because while Israel does have some right to self-defense, because there is a very big problem with where Palestine, or specifically Hamas, they will in fact set up missiles and launch them from residential areas, and it's just, you kind of have to ask yourself, okay, well, what is Israel supposed to do? Because if they attack back, there's going to be casualties there. It sort of, Hamas gives them no choice. And that's actually an intention of Hamas. And that's why the leftists are wrong, because Hamas is insane. That's one thing you do have to point out, is Hamas, the strategy of Hamas is to do things in an attempt to almost force Israel to do something in response that makes them look bad. Hamas basically antagonizes and then plays the victim when Israel fights back. That's effectively Hamas's strategy, is to make themselves look like the victims and to make Israel look bad, because they know they don't actually have the power to win in that fight. So they just do incredibly deranged things like, say, the kidnapping, because they know that that's going to invoke a response from Israel. And the problem with Israel is that, again, because they have the similar problem where they've also been raised to basically hate Palestinians, is that not only do they respond, but they overstep their grounds. So they sort of give in to that sort of victim complex automatically and have no problem with just indiscriminately blowing up various places in Gaza. And what we libertarians should do, the correct response, really just kind of comes into what Hans Hermann Hoppe and other libertarians have said, is that we should just be calling for peace on both sides, and we should be accepting the fact that neither one of them is actually right. They're both wrong. We should be sending zero aid to Israel and zero aid to Palestine. And that pisses off both Republicans and Democrats and the far left, that libertarians will do that we will take the position that we shouldn't be sending money to either of them because both of them are bad. Yeah, both sides bad. That's why pick a sidism is a cancerous way to look at things. You shouldn't have to pick a side between Israel and Palestine because they both do things that are wrong. And there was an interesting interview. I'm sorry, it wasn't an interview. It was a letter to Walter Block from Hans Hermann Hoppe, where Hans Hermann Hoppe basically explained to Walter that Israel doesn't have collective ownership of Israel. They really don't. There's this weird collective ownership of the land based on 1,000 years ago. And in order for you to actually claim property rights to land from 1,000 years ago, you need to have a huge paper trail from previous owner to previous owner, previous owner, previous owner, previous owner, proving that you actually own that plot of land. And well, Israel just doesn't have that. And most Palestinians don't have that either. Maybe a few of them might have that to very specific small parts, but really neither side has that. They just don't. And so what we should be doing is just calling for peace and really pushing the idea that one of them should leave, even though I know that neither of them are going to, unfortunately. But that's the only way I see this conflict ending, is that, for instance, if other Arab states were to actually open up their borders to Palestinians and let them just leave, that would probably be the most peaceful resolution of the conflict.
The left's support of Palestine is, certainly built on incorrect reasoning. I mean, I do think I'm probably a bit more sympathetic towards the Palestinian predicament, but basically my problem with the left is that they should be supporting if they're going to support the Palestinians, they should do that out of a consistent adherence to the NAP. But the left is, supporting them because they are, as you're saying, pretty much the little guy here, in that they're the less culturally and less technologically advanced society. I mean, if we follow property consistently, though, I would also say that, Israel, like you're also saying, has very much overstepped their bounds in terms of their retribution for what happened on October 7th of last year. So yes, Hamas is certainly an evil organization, and everybody involved in that attack from October 7th should receive, I would say, swift retribution. I mean, I would have been fine with Israel destroying Hamas if they went no further than Hamas. In this case, I do think that Netanyahu's military strategy against Palestine has been pretty indiscriminate. So my question is, what is your stance on Netanyahu's actions?
He's basically deranged. I mean, what I kind of said about the psychological aspect, that he, as much as I hate to say this because it's racist language and I don't like calling things out, but Netanyahu, he's basically a racial supremacist for his own people. He does not care about the lives of Palestinians at all. I mean, he is in the right to do something because Israel's being attacked by Hamas, but he's one of those people who views it as, my ethnicity is worth more than everybody else. He values the fingernail of an Israelite Jew over the life of a Palestinian. And so he just greatly oversteps his bound because he just doesn't care about their lives at all.
I do think the main thing we should be focusing on is keeping this response focused squarely on the, on the guilty parties. What this ties into exactly what you're saying, and that, both parties are ultimately wrong.
Yeah, and that's where actually I can see where you're going with this. That's actually where the beauty of the libertarian solution kind of comes into. By no longer sending Israel effectively a blank check, by no longer giving Tel Aviv a blank check of American taxpayer money, that would effectively force Netanyahu and force Israel to actually think about their finances upon what they're doing and actually make better decisions. Because when you give an aggressive agency, a state, basically a violent gang, as Hans Hermann Hoppe calls them, when you give them an unlimited blank check, they're just going to do whatever the heck they want. And when you have someone who, again, is a racial supremacist in charge of what's going on, it's not going to be good. So one way to kind of rail them in and force them to make more rational decisions and force them to actually think about what they're doing is to actually give them a limit. Stop sending them aid, and they'll actually be forced to use their military a little bit more wisely. Maybe actually, put some effort into finding Hamas instead of just bombing random places if they didn't have unlimited access to American taxpayer money. So actually cutting them off in many ways is a very simple and effective way to kind of fix the problem and force them to find more peaceful or at least more correct solutions.
The relationship between the U.S. and Israel has become very complicated in this case.
Corrupt is the best way to say it. It's not just complicated, it's corrupt.
Yes, exactly. And by sending them money, the American government, I would say, is most certainly an accomplice in what's going on there. They're essentially giving them reason to do that. I mean, it is something where this is a very complicated situation, and really, I would say that it's one where the libertarian perspective is really the only one that can truly win out at the end.
Right, and unfortunately, no one's listening to us on it. I mean, a few are. For instance, leftists are also currently saying that we should stop funding Israel. They're wrong on also sending aid to
Yep,
Hamas,
exactly.
basically.
Yes.
They're okay with us saying aid to Palestine, which would really just be aid to Hamas, which would also be stupid. But they are actually correct on not giving money to Tel Aviv anymore, or not sending Israel a blank check again of American taxpayer money. They're right for the wrong reason, but they are correct. And maybe perhaps we can make use of that and get people who are supporting our solution for the wrong reason. If we can potentially use that to maybe get the right solution in, it's a little bit complicated and a little bit underhanded of us to do that, but it might be the only way. But really, libertarians should just be saying what we're saying and just keep pointing out that, hey, not only is not sending taxpayer money to these various, I guess, aggressive entities would be how you could call both Israel and Palestine at this point, not only is not sending them money correct on just libertarian principle that we consider taxation to be theft, it's also correct because it would solve the problem. It's actually correct just from a consequentialist point of view, not just a natural law point of view, that sending either of these people money is making it worse because both of them are aggressively racist towards each other. And so giving them funds in their war, it's just going to make it worse. They're just going to keep going at it until neither of them is left because that's just how they think. And ultimately, we should give them $0 and force them to actually think about how they're spending their resources and ultimately either go back to a somewhat peaceful coexistence. It's not really peaceful if you know the history of Israel and Palestine, of what they were doing before October 7th.
Yes, that was not the start.
Yeah, at least return to a background noise radiation that they're all just kind of ignoring, but it was at least better than it was now. And either return to that, or again, unfortunately, the ultimate solution is that one of them has to leave. I don't see this actually getting better other than that solution of there should be a peaceful divorce between Israel and Palestine. I know that won't actually happen because, again, both of them believe that they have a right to a holy land, which is just another can of worms right there.
The proposed two-state solution, which has become very, popular according to some, do you question how successful that would be?
A two-state solution would be better than what we currently have now with them, and if it's possible to have it, if it's possible for them to negotiate that and maybe tone down the hatred between the groups enough that they could do a two-state solution, then yes, it is valid. Unfortunately, from what I've seen, I don't recall the exact numbers, but they've been doing polls on sort of young Palestinians and young Israelites, and they just don't believe in it. There was a time where a two-state solution could have been reasonably implemented on Israel and Palestine, and that time unfortunately just may have passed. The hate is too strong between them for it to even work. They dislike each other so much that it won't even put up with a two-state solution. It would be better if it could be implemented again over what we have now, and calling Gaza an open state, a sort of open air prison camp, isn't entirely inaccurate. And so if we could do it, then we should do it, but it just might not work, and there's also a good chance that the people would still reject it there.
Unfortunately, that appears to be the way that it is. It is also worth noting that really, perhaps this whole situation could essentially be avoided in an anarcho-capitalist society, for example. I don't think they'd be able to actually fund the type of, war that they've been having for all this time in a purely, privatized society. What exactly do you think would be the value of bringing anarcho-capitalist principles to this region?
They would help a lot because then you could have privatized cities and then you could have freedom of association between them, and people would just choose whether or not they'd want to be in a private city run by Israelites or a private city where both of them that are actually comprised of the specific individual people that want to try and get along, and then a private city of, say, Palestinians. So covenant communities could kind of solve the problem to some degree. The only issue I would see, the only thing that you almost can't solve, even with anarcho-capitalist principles, is Jerusalem, because you have them both. They're both going to try and lay claim on some kind of spiritual divine right to Jerusalem. They both kind of believe that they own that place, and so that might be a little bit of a problem. Although you could just have general property rights in that issue, and whoever can homestead that an area around there and hopefully get along peacefully, then yes, it would be better than what we currently have. But again, the root cause of this problem is effectively just an ethnic hatred that both Palestinians and Israelites have against each other, and there's just unfortunately no good solution to it. I hate to put it that way. I hate to be kind of a black pillar on that, but my knowledge of human psychology, that's kind of a difference between me and some other libertarians, is that I don't just study economics and philosophy. I also study psychology quite a bit. It's in a bad spot right now. I'll just put it that way. It's in such a bad spot that even anarcho-capitalism, it'd definitely help, and it might make the subsequent generations of Israelites and Palestinians get along. So if it was possible for us to do, we should do it. But as for saving the people alive right now who've already kind of passed the age of where they can question reality, I think there's a population there right now that they just can't be saved. Sorry.
Hopefully the future will show more promise in this particular situation. Hopefully things will get better in the days coming ahead. And not just for Israel and Palestine, but for the rest of the world as well, in terms of free market, libertarian principles. So, with that said, thanks for coming on, Mentiswave. And to everybody out listening in, thanks for tuning in. This has been Morgan Meets the Eye. Make sure to follow Mentiswave and myself, and subscribe, comment, and above all, keep asking why. Everybody out there, have a good one. Bye-bye.